Too Much Information is a production of iHeart Radio. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Too Much Information, the show that brings you the secret histories and little-known stories behind your favorite movies, music, TV shows, and more. We are your boys in the bubble of banality, your human trampolines of trivia, spinning in infinity, to which I say, Amen and Hallelujah. My name is Jordan Runtagh, but you can call me Betty.
I'm not setting you up for this.
Oh,
And
God damn it.
I'm Alex Heigl.
And you can call him Al.
No, you can't. Don't do that. I don't like that. That's one of the only nicknames I don't like.
I've never called you Al.
Thank you. Good.
Yeah,
Moving
all right.
on.
Yes, I think everybody here knows what I'm talking about. In fact, everybody here knows exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about one of the most beloved and controversial albums in history, Paul Simon's 1986 masterwork, Graceland. It's a frequent entry on all-time best album lists, and deservedly so as far as I'm concerned. It was a success on pretty much every level, artistically, commercially, and culturally. It's certainly a favorite of mine, and Oprah's, I understand. The music was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, blending South African rhythms, modalities, and vocals with American dance pop music, plus a little bit of Zydeco and Southwestern Mexican sounds for good measure. In an era of overblown pan-global musical statements like We Are the World, Graceland was much more successful at linking cultures through music, even though it caused an international incident in the process that nearly killed Paul Simon on several occasions. Heigl, what do you think of this record?
It's amazing. I love this record.
Yeah.
I love Paul Simon. I was not supposed to. I'm first and foremost a punk. First and foremost a punk. You're not supposed to like Paul Simon, but yeah, man. I mean, I love Paul Simon. He's an incredible songwriter, world-class dickhead, short king. The list of reasons goes on and on. Incredible guitar player, great singer.
He is an underrated guitar player. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
And vocals too. And his voice, I don't think has ever sounded better than on this record. There's all these great isolated takes of this from the box set, and the version of Diamonds on the Soles of Her Shoes that's just bass and vocals. That little run that he does. His voice is so good on this. This was not like the cliche of like yuppie dinner music for me. Like I never heard this record growing up. I knew You Can Call Me Al from like the radio, but I never heard this record in my house. I never heard it through friends. It was really only in college when Vampire Weekend came around, and to a lesser extent, Dirty Projectors. More rich white guys from New York who were stealing African sounds, much more so with Vampire Weekend. I mean, they have a song called Cape Cod Kwassa Kwassa, and they also took like so much of the production cues off this. Dirty Projectors a little bit less so, but they definitely had some of that kind of African tonality and vocal stuff in there. And then I almost went back to school for ethnomusicology. That was like my alternate reality career track, and so I
didn't know. I'm learning this live on mic. I did not know that. Wow.
I was super interested in. I am super interested in all of it, but particularly African music, and this was just kind of a gateway for it. And then like I got into all kinds of Malian music, and I got really interested in Mbira music, like thumb piano stuff, and obviously Fela Kuti was huge for me, and yeah, all that stuff is just so fascinating to me, and it's an incredible record in terms of the political dimensions of it, but also in terms of just the sheer sound of, because I'll talk about this a little later on, but like this is 86. Basses and guitars had only really been around. Electric basses and electric guitars were not that old, so like the sound of these guys playing centuries old African music on electric instruments is still kind of a new thing, at least in terms of the scope of like African music and that history. So it really is like kind of a quietly revolutionary thing in terms of getting it into Western ears. It's just so funny that it comes across, when you think of like people who are like super into deep Afrobeat and like deep Fela Kuti, that's like, Fela Kuti was like almost killed by the government. So there's like really, that's like edgy, like raw, actual or like sub-Saharan stuff like Tanarawen, like those guys were rebels against the government. And then it's just so funny to me that there's all that like really interesting, like counter cultural African music that has become popular but the most popular form is like the most milquetoast little nebbishy white dude. It's such a thorny, complicated legacy, and I'm so excited to talk about it.
Yeah, we'll touch on it more later on in the episode, but yeah, I mean, it's impossible or at least irresponsible to talk about the amazing music on Graceland without discussing its genesis in
Yeah.
South Africa, where apartheid was still the law of the land.
Yeah, I mean, two things can be true at the same time is ultimately what
Yeah.
this is like it's a collection of amazing songs that touched millions of people, not least of which some of the people who helped make it, but it can also be some of the worst examples of white privilege and also Paul Simon being a dick. It's like two things can be true at the same time, man. And you know,
Yes.
owing to our positions and privileges, I do think we should foreground some of the negative stuff, at least to kind of check the millions of dollars this made him.
Yes, Paul Simon traveled to South Africa to record this album with local musicians, violating a boycott that had been established by the United Nations Anti-Apartheid Committee. This caused some problems. And by seeking to make music that transcended politics, Paul Simon found himself at the center of a human rights crisis that unfolded basically on the world stage. It was an incredibly complex issue at the time, and the conversations around it really remain difficult to this day. Upon the release of Graceland in 1986, people generally felt one of three ways about Paul Simon, I'd say. To some, he was a rebellious hero taking a stand for artists against bureaucracy and totalitarian regimes. Others thought he was a naive and idealistic hippie who undermined the anti-apartheid cause by going there. And still others thought he was a thief, like countless colonialists before him, going to Africa and plundering what was there. Paul Simon himself summed up this public perception in later years. He said, "Here's this white guy from New York, and he ripped off these poor innocent guys." I wrote about all this in an article for Rolling Stone tied to the album's 30th anniversary in 2016, which I'd like to cite now. Not because I'm one of those guys who likes to quote himself, but I just don't want to accidentally self-plagiarize and get in trouble. The fundamental debate surrounding the ethics of Graceland hinges on two questions. Was Paul Simon right in breaking the boycott, and did he have the right to make the album at all? Let's discuss question one first. There are many who would argue that the South African cultural boycott was a deeply flawed strategy that did more harm than good for the disenfranchised people that it was put in place to support. This view is shared by all of the musicians who played with Paul on Graceland. Sax player Barney Ratchabane said in 2020, "In South Africa, we had no opportunity. You could have dreams, but they never come true. It really destroys you. But Graceland opened my eyes and set a tone of hope in my life." Yet this very uplifting revelation is countered by Dali Tambo, the founder of the Artists Against Apartheid organization, who felt that Paul Simon put the showbiz ambitions of a handful of local musicians above the struggle of a nation. Tambo told the New York Times, "We were fighting for our land, for our identity. We had a job to do, and it was a serious job. And we saw Paul Simon coming as a threat because it was not sanctioned by the liberation movement." And then we get to question two, the question of whether Paul Simon had the right to make the album at all. And this question has gotten more complicated with the passing of the decades. It's important to remember that terms like cultural appropriation didn't really exist when Graceland was recorded in 1985. Whether you called it borrowing, paying homage to, riffing on, or stealing, white artists have been incorporating traditionally black music into their work for most of the 20th century. Go back to, George Gershwin even. But Graceland was groundbreaking because it wore its influences so nakedly, and it credited them, which was crucial. South African musicians and singers were invited to share the spotlight, giving many of them mainstream international exposure for the first time. And Paul Simon's insistence that Graceland was a true collaboration, in quotes, is up for debate. But the album did manage to provide a platform for a group of musicians who were legally prohibited from participating in an international stage. And that counts for something. Still, elements of the Graceland project remain problematic to some. The South African trombonist and anti-apartheid activist Jonas Gwangwa summed up the thoughts of probably countless black artists when confronted with Graceland's success. "So, it has taken another white man to discover my people?" he asked.
Yeah, I mean, the other big thing about this is that Paul Simon tried to duck a lot of this just by paying people more, but he ultimately, it's still the exact same Chess Records Berry Gordy thing. Like the John Mulaney famously said, you'll take all my song rights and just give me a shiny new Cadillac, Mr. Gordy." Like, Yeah, you could pay people really well to record, but if you're not giving them songwriting credits and percentages off that, that's still a one-day paycheck or a one, like the Motown musicians. Like, you pay them by the hour, sure, that's fair in the moment, but you're still ultimately in control of the publishing and making millions of dollars off of it over 50 years instead of hundreds of dollars off of it over several hours.
Well, Paul put, I think, 5 out of 11 songs on Graceland. He has co-writes with some of the African musicians he played with.
Initially, though?
Yeah,
Okay.
I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
I thought this was one of those. I mean,
It wasn't a retro.
I was going to say, I thought it was like a Led Zeppelin thing where he was like, fine, I'll do it.
All in all, lots of challenging questions to consider as we dive into this fascinating story about an album that, for me, represents a high watermark in recorded music and a brilliant cross-cultural experience that, as I said earlier, succeeds on nearly every level. So without further ado, here is everything you didn't know about Paul Simon's Graceland. Well, we got to start at the very beginning. In 1984, Paul Simon was at a crossroads. Actually, no, he wasn't. He wasn't at a crossroads at all. He was basically at rock bottom. And this was not a place where Paul Simon ever really found himself. He dominated the 70s with a string of critical and commercial hits like every big Paul Simon song that isn't on Graceland. But he entered the 80s with One Trick Pony, which was a film written by and starring himself, plus an accompanying musical soundtrack. Neither of these, the album or the movie, was especially well received. Have you ever seen this?
Nope.
Oh, me neither.
Don't want to.
All right, moving on. But Paul's stock rose in September of 1981 when he and Art Garfunkel reunited for their famous concert in Central Park, which drew a mind-blowing 500,000 people to the Great Lawn and became one of the biggest musical events in history, bigger than Woodstock, supposedly. That is crazy. They planned a subsequent reunion tour, but then old tensions quickly returned, and a proposed reunion album tentatively titled Think Too Much fell through. They'd been recording it together, but Paul ultimately wiped Artie's vocals from the track, which is an under-discussed petty move on his part. I love that. Paul Simon's could always be counted on for some kind of deliciously petty.
Yeah. Knife in the ribs.
Yep.
Even his own.
Yeah. The resulting solo album was released in 1983 as Hearts and Bones, which is just one of the most crushing records of his career. It's filled with allusions to his troubled relationship with actress Carrie Fisher. And the only thing sadder than a devastating breakup record is a devastating breakup record that flops, which Hearts and Bones did. It became the lowest charting record of his career, totally outstripped by the new vanguard of MTV hitmakers like Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Prince. And Paul Simon would later say, I had a personal blow and a career setback, and the combination of the two just put me into a tailspin. And he even told his friend Philip Glass, the composer, that he was no longer interested in writing hits around this time. So, with his career at a low ebb, his personal life in shambles, and completely estranged from his singing partner, Paul Simon spent the spring of 1984 pondering his next move, and he did so in the driveway of his property in Montauk, Long Island, watching workmen build the house he'd planned for himself and Carrie Fisher. Which, honestly, that should have been a song. That is devastating. He would just sit in the driveway, spark up a joint, and listen to tapes.
There's absolutely no more mid-century like white guy image than someone sitting in their Montauk driveway, stoned, watching
workmen.
Yeah, watching workmen build their house next to SNL impresarios. Lorne Michaels.
Yes.
That's a John Cheever short story.
Yeah, pretty much. Wow. So he's sitting in the driveway, and to pass the time, he would often listen to tapes, and he especially liked one specific tape, a bootleg tape of South African music with the handwritten label Accordion Jive Hits Volume 2. Now, the way that he obtained this tape is an interesting story. Graceland was obviously a major collaborative effort featuring work by a host of underrepresented people and cultures, but Graceland likely wouldn't have happened at all had it not been for Lorne Michaels, the producer of Saturday Night Live. There are several ways that Lorne was basically the fairy godfather of the Graceland story, and we'll touch on more later. Lorne and Paul were close friends and neighbors out on Long Island, and yeah, I think Paul was building his house either close to or directly next door to Lorne's in Montauk. Now, a lot of people forget that Lorne Michaels actually left Saturday Night Live in 1980, 5 years into the show's run, to try his hand at making what was basically a primetime version of SNL. And this new show was called, fittingly, The New Show. And unfortunately, The New Show failed to catch on and was canceled in the spring of 1984 after, I think, just 9 episodes. It didn't last long. And this was bad news for the defunct show's band leader, Heidi Berg, who'd been lured away from her prior gig on SNL. She chose poorly. She went to Lorne one day after the show got canceled to try to figure out what her next new gig could be, and Lorne suggested she go to speak to his good friend Paul Simon, who kept offices from him just down the hall at New York City's Brill Building. So Heidi Berg paid Paul a visit and played him some of her songs. One thing led to another, and eventually he offered to produce an album for her. And as an example of how she wanted this album to sound, Heidi loaned Paul this bootleg tape with the homemade label Accordion Jive Hits Volume 2. It was township jive music from Soweto, which was a black suburb on the outskirts of Johannesburg.
Yeah, township is interesting. It comes from like the literal townships, which were these. I mean, they were slums. They were racially segregated slums in South Africa that the government basically pushed everyone who wasn't white into. It was like
It's almost like a Native American reservation, essentially, but
you guys
far,
can
far
live
worse.
here.
Yeah.
But it's funny because there's so many micro genres in there that all fall under the heading of township. I mean, it's almost like saying like blues or rock music. Because all these guys were living in these environments, and everyone took the kind of music that they grew up in and came and found new influences from and combined them in different ways. There's one in particular called Kwela music that is just all built around penny whistles, which is why you hear so many like penny whistle sounds.
You can call me out, yeah.
And all over the, I mean, and it's just they were like, so much of this stuff comes from being like, well, we have very cheap instruments. What can we do with that? And
And the answer is incredible things.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, there's a lot that folds into that genre specifically. I mean, there's a great music comp series called The Indestructible Beat.
Molly Brown?
Yes. No, The Indestructible Beat of Soweto, which is 1985. So like very like,
oh, wow.
It's
It's when he went down there, yeah.
yeah, it's one of the most formative comps of that that came out at the time. And it's got Ladysmith Black Mambazo on it. So anyway.
So this tape that she played Paul was filled with jangly guitars and saxophones and really interesting percussive elements. And most fascinating to her, accordions, because she really loved this accordion sound that was a hallmark of this music.
Yeah, the accordion is so interesting I mean, the term world music is problematic. You can't take every kind of music that isn't American music and flatten it into one label. But let me just say that the accordion's presence on the international non-Europe, non-American stage is very interesting because like in a lot of Mexico, like Tejano Conjunto music and from Mexico, like the reason that a lot of that stuff developed is because they would get either missionaries or sailors coming in with like concertinas and accordions, and then people would take those instruments because they were cheap and portable, and basically take music that had been purely vocal, passed down through oral tradition for decades and centuries, and then just start porting it to these instruments. So in Africa, you get it because sailors had brought like concertinas in, and so it sort of spread through the continent from the coasts, and also through missionaries who brought accordions in. And that's how, because you don't have like reed organ keyboard instruments in very, very old African traditions. That's not so much a thing, but they adopted this stuff because you could take it from village to village, you could travel with it, and that's where you get that sound that so much of it is based around.
I mean, you hear it on the opening track of Graceland, The Boy in the Bubble. I think it's the first sound that you hear on the record, and that wasn't an accident. Like, he wanted that kind of wild cartwheeling accordion sound, very disorienting, to sort of herald that this was going to be a very new kind of sound that you hadn't really heard before.
Accordion and gated drums, gated reverb.
Yes. So Heidi Berg, Lorne Michaels' friend, lent this cassette to Paul Simon on the condition that she could have it back in a week. This was her favorite tape, and there was only one copy of it. So Paul put it on his car stereo during one of his drives out to Montauk to supervise the construction of his new house, or sit in the driveway and moon over Carrie Fisher. But much like Heidi Berg, he was instantly captivated by this music. He later said it was very good summer music, happy music. It sounded like very early rock and roll to me. Black, urban, mid-50s rock and roll, like the Great Atlantic tracks from that period.
Yeah, and the thing that I love about this comparison is that he says later on something that isn't true, which is that this music only has major chords in it, which is not true. But it's very funny that he got that coming from folk music and coming from early rock and roll, which by and large is 1-4-5 major tonality chord progressions, and even like the bass patterns in soul music and blues patterns are coming from the pentatonic scale, which is what you hear in a lot of African music. It's all based around major and minor pentatonic. Which is kind of an oversimplification because those are the building blocks of all music. There's a really cool lecture that Bobby McFerrin gives that is up on that Bobby McFerrin, which is up on YouTube, where he basically he's pretending to be on a keyboard on stage, and he tells the crowd, like, here's your tonic, your root note, and then he jumps on stage from like position to position, up and down, up the major pentatonic scale, and he's like, here's your scale, and then he starts jumping around and skipping notes, and the crowd follows him, and he's using this to illustrate that it's like this really ingrained like scale that is like universal to almost all forms of music, almost all geographical locations in music. I mean, if you start tearing apart like the way that pentatonic actually, the arrangement of those notes actually works, you hear it in like Native American music, you hear it in Chinese music, so it's really interesting. But particularly his comparison to rock and roll and blues, because like folk music cliche is the 1-4-5 chord progression, same with early blues and rock and roll. So yeah, I just think it's interesting that he heard those. I mean, obviously, of course, he heard that he's Paul Simon, but that comparison is on the money in a way that is not just a facile, weird thing to say.
So after about a month of listening to this tape, which I have to add is well over a week, remember Heidi Berg wanted it back in a week. She wanted this tape back in a week. He said that he started improvising melodies over it as he listened. And this wasn't a serious attempt to compose anything. He was just singing along to the cassette for fun. And aside from the nondescript title, Accordion Jive Hits Volume 2, the tape bore no hint of the music's origin. He knew it came from South Africa, but that was pretty much all he had to go on. So you would say, after a couple of weeks of driving back and forth to the house and listening to the tape, I thought, what is this tape? This is my favorite tape. I wonder who this band is. And eventually he called Warner Brothers label chief Lenny Waronker to help track it down. And Waronker got in touch with South African producer Hilton Rosenthal, who identified Paul's favorite track on the tape as an instrumental called Gumboots by the Boyoyo Boys. And Paul had an idea of buying the track outright and writing his own words and melody to record over top, which is something he actually has a history of doing. That's what he did for the Simon & Garfunkel song El Condor Pasa from the Bridge Over Troubled Water album. That had been an old Andean folk song that he just bought the rights to and wrote his own music over top.
So, poor Heidi never got her tape back. Nor did she get the album that he was supposed to produce with her. She finally met up with Paul.
She got the sense that Paul was like kind of avoiding her.
Ducking her.
Say that, yeah.
So she catches up with him backstage at one of his concerts, and she gets talking with him, and he talks about how excited he is to go and record an album of this music that he'd heard on the tape. And she reportedly holds out her hands and says, "Where's my end?" Yeah. The other thing that I've heard here is that she was like talking to him about this, and she was like, "Well, I'm just going to get studio musicians to make something that sounds like this." And he said to her, "Why don't you just go to South Africa and record?" And she was like, "I'm not rich." And the wheels began turning in Paul's head. Their relationship obviously deteriorated. She was name-checked in the liner notes to Graceland, but too little,
pretty
too
prominently, yeah.
She later said, "I loaned him the tape because I wanted to make a record. I didn't loan him the tape so he would make a record." There are two slightly different versions of this story in two wildly contrasting biographies. There's Peter Ames Carlin's Paul Simon bio from 2016, and then there's Robert Hilburn's bio from 2018. The Hilburn one was made with Paul Simon's cooperation. And
So it's a lot more sympathetic.
yeah, and the Hilburn one goes out of its way to note that asked if she'd ever thought of going to South Africa to record the music, Heidi said no. She just liked the accordion part. Carlin's version is that she was like, "Oh yeah, I'll just recreate it here with studio musicians in the States." And Paul Simon was like, "Well, why don't you go to South Africa?" And she was like, "I don't have your credit card, or I guess liquid assets." But the end result of all this is that Paul Simon got his mojo back.
No longer sitting in his driveway for his unbuilt house.
Watching day laborers. Paul Simon finally felt sufficiently motivated to steal from black people. His longtime engineer, Roy Heigl, later said that he knew Paul would bounce back from his post-Hearts and Bones depression because he was the most competitive person I've ever known. And this manifested in Paul's apparently rejuvenated creative spirit and his desire to make this record. There's a Randy Newman story here. Let's go to Jordan's Randy Newman corner. You love this story. I want you to read it.
Oh, thank you. I love this story too. Randy Newman tells this great story of playing wiffle ball with Paul Simon once, which I want an oral history of that moment. I don't know how that came to pass. But apparently Randy Newman was on the pitcher's mound and Paul Simon was batting in this wiffle ball game. And as he stood at the plate, Paul was just muttering to himself, "I've got to hit it. I've got to hit it." And Randy said, he could have been kidding, but it felt serious. He really cared about that stupid wiffle ball game.
Good for him.
It's good to have goals.
I want to know what do you think Randy Newman's was Randy Newman a wiffle ball guy? I see him more as like a wrestler.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Randy Newman.
Or a bowler. I could see him as a bowler. He's got the stocky.
Yeah.
They started to have discussions about how to go about recording this album, and the bootleg Boyoyo Boys tape really wasn't up to technical standards, so they would have to re-record it for Paul to be able to sing over top of it. And the brass at Warner Brothers tried to convince him to just get some good players and record it in New York, but much like James Cameron, Paul wanted authenticity. He wanted to go there. He wanted to use the players in the region and record it on their home turf. And Paul Simon was sort of famous for doing this, going on these musical field trips, to get the sounds that he wanted. When he wished to explore the emerging reggae sounds on his 1972 track Mother and Child Reunion, he traveled to Kingston, Jamaica to record in the famous Dynamic Sound Studios. And when he wanted to add an extra dose of funk to the album There Goes Ryman Simon the following year in 1973, he went to Alabama and recorded with the Muscle Shoals Sound Rhythm Section. As he told National Geographic in 2012, "I learned pretty early on, if you want to get the music right, you should probably travel to where it's being played, as opposed to asking musicians who are not familiar with it to copy it." So he decided he would have to go to South Africa. And what's more, he thought this was the perfect time in his career to do it. He was so commercially cold that he could take risks without having to justify it to anxious label executives. He said, "Part of me thought, great, no one's going to be looking over my shoulder saying, 'What's the next single going to be?' Or 'What the hell are you going to Africa for?' Suddenly, no one's saying anything about me, and I'm just going by my instincts. I was just excited by the music." So to get the sounds that he heard on the bootleg Accordion Jive Volume 2 tape, he would have to go to South Africa. And as he later said with hilarious understatement, "At first I thought, it's too bad the tape isn't from Zimbabwe or Zaire or Nigeria, because life would have been simpler."
One of those more convenient African countries. For me, Paul Simon. God, it's so inconvenient that they're under apartheid rule. For me, Paul Simon makes my life so much more. God.
He's like an old brill building era hustler, and that's how he talks about dealing with the South African government. He basically thinks that they're trying to hustle him. Is really what it boils down to.
This fucking guy. His beautiful, beautiful music. Recording in South Africa in the mid-'80s was dangerous, A, and prohibited, B, by the United Nations. This was the time of the famous aforementioned international boycott in protest of the South African government, who instituted apartheid or separateness, whereby the white minority ruled and disenfranchised everyone who wasn't white.
They weren't even citizens. They stripped them of their citizenship and all their rights.
Yeah. In December 1980, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 35/206, which forced all states to prevent all cultural, academic, sporting, and other exchanges with South Africa, and ordered writers, artists, musicians, and other personalities to boycott the nation. This was so strict that it technically extended to working with South African players who weren't even in the country at the time. Paul Simon did not believe this applied to him. Depending on your stance, you could simply say that he was making an argument on behalf of art transcending all borders, or he was simply angered that it inconvenienced him and his love of accordion music. Again, two things can be true at the same time. In the 2012 documentary Under African Skies, Paul Simon returns to South Africa for the first time in 25 years and meets with Dali Tambo, who's the founder of Artists Against Apartheid and the son of the African National Congress president Oliver Tambo. He had been an outspoken opponent of Graceland, and Paul sits down with him at Tambo's home and argues that Paul Simon was right. Tambo tells him, "We'd been saying to artists at this point in the history of South Africa, the expression of your support must be non-participatory. You can't go there. If you go there, you become part of apartheid's attempt to gain international legitimacy. That is how solidarity works. If you break a strike line, you are a scab. If you break a boycott, you are in violation of it." And, we'll get into the Sun City thing later, but it's interesting that Simon and Garfunkel turned down an offer to perform at Sun City. This is a resort that was located in the supposedly independent tribal homeland 90 miles outside of Johannesburg. But in practice, what it was a loophole for the South African government to bring white international superstars in to perform in what was essentially South Africa under the veneer of a different name and legal jurisdiction.
So in any event, Paul Simon didn't like being told what to do, and he wanted to make the kind of music he wanted to make exactly where he wanted to make it. And this was early 1985, and Paul happened to run into Harry Belafonte at a star-studded recording session for the granddaddy of all charity singles, We Are the World. As one does. Paul knew that Harry was a legendary civil rights activist, and he asked his advice on how to handle the South Africa situation. Harry encouraged Paul's musical endeavors, but he also encouraged him to check with, quote, the powers that prevail in the African National Congress, which was South Africa's anti-apartheid opposition party, which had been led by Nelson Mandela before his imprisonment in 1964. Paul didn't want to ask permission, didn't want to wait. As Harry Belafonte said in the Under African Skies documentary, I can't read this with the right face. Harry seems to give him the benefit of the doubt. He takes a very generous read on the situation. He said, Paul declared that the power of art and the voice of the artist was supreme, and to beg the rite of passage was against his instinct. Paul had a much more quaint way of putting it to Dali Tambo. He said, it's like having your dad tell you not to take the car out on a date that you really want to go on. You take the car anyway. Paul Simon was a little more articulate to the New York Times. He said, I knew I would be criticized if I went, even though I wasn't going to record for the government or to perform for segregated audiences. I was following my musical instincts and wanting to work with the people whose music I greatly admired.
Incredible. Good for him. And I say that sarcastically. Paul Simon also went to his black friends, begging them to tell him he was an okay person for doing this. He went to Quincy Jones, which, as you very eloquently described it, is like going to mom after dad said no. Quincy was more laid back about the whole thing, telling Paul, just make sure everybody gets paid and that everybody likes it. And so Paul Simon in the spirit of time immemorial of white guys everywhere believing there is no problem you can't throw money at until it goes away, offered triple U.S. union scale, $200 an hour instead of $15 an hour to the musicians, and promised to share writing credits for any musical or lyrical input.
South African musicians were getting $15 an hour. Jesus Christ.
For like, what, 10 songs a day, you said, when they were cutting this stuff in that studio? Yeah. And that was a good enough deal that even the South African Black Musicians Union passed a resolution to formally invite Simon to record in their country. I have tons of black friends. They all said this was okay. My incredibly wealthy black friend, Quincy Jones, said this was okay, so I'm doing it. Have some money, please. Tell me I'm a good person. Tell me, please. Tell me I'm a good person, please. Have some money.
It's complicated. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Too Much Information in just a moment. Paul and engineer Roy Heigl flew to South Africa in February 1985 for what they intended to be a semi-secret trip. But as we said earlier, Paul Simon's career was at such a low ebb that there was really no need for secrecy. He said, "I was so cold that I could do this all privately. Nobody would be checking in." And though it's often been said that these South African musicians were thrilled to perform with a star of Paul Simon's caliber, this is not strictly true. There was a mixed response among the local South African musicians, with some very eager to play with him and some not so much. Bassist Bakithi Kumalo, who worked a day job as a mechanic in a car garage, had no idea who Paul Simon was. And when he finally made the connection, I think it was with Mother and Child Reunion was the only song that he sort of dimly was aware of Paul's. Even then, he was even more confused as to why this American superstar wanted to record with them. He said, "I kind of wondered what we were doing. I mean, I continued to ask myself, who's going to want to hear this township music in America?"
Yeah, he's so funny. All the interviews with him, he's like, I was listening to Weather Report. I was very much into jazz fusion at the time. So this must have been very baffled by this 5'3" Jewish songwriter coming in and stuffing money down his shirt.
With producer Hilton Rosenthal on hand to bridge the cultural gap as best he could, they holed up in Johannesburg's Ovation Studios, which was a state-of-the-art 24-track studio, and called in a steady stream of local musicians. They're the Boyoyo Boys, who set this whole journey off with their song on the bootleg tape Paul loved, as well as members of the popular South African group called Stimela. There was Lulu Masilela, and General M.D. Sharinda and the Gaza Sisters. And given the skepticism I just mentioned, it's probably understandable that the first day was a little tense. The musicians went out of their way to call all the white people sir, and they were very concerned about doing the wrong thing because, like I said, they were used to cranking out like 10 songs a day, and this was far from Paul's MO. Instead of having a specific song in mind, Paul just wanted to play and see what happened. And the whole idea was that they would jam for 10 to 30 minutes, very loose, no headphones, all in this garage-like room. And then Paul would go back to America and try to piece together tracks and write lyrics over top. And sometimes he would use only a little bit of a jam. And a good example of this is the song Graceland itself, which I believe only pulled the drum track played by VC Kumalo, although they might have actually re-recorded it now that I think about it. But this technique, it was not unlike a modern hip-hop producer chopping up pre-existing songs to create new beats. And this completely inverted the normal way that Paul made records, which was writing a song first and then coming into the studio to record the track. And this was essentially an anecdote to what he thought had gone wrong in his previous album, Hearts and Bones, where he loved the songs that he'd written, but he felt that the tracks themselves weren't very exciting and kind of come up short. So in this case, he could start with a really exciting track and then build a melody and lyrics around it. And if he wound up not really liking the song he wrote for it, he could scrap it and go back to the original basic track and start building it up again. And that's what happened with the album's opener, The Boy in the Bubble. It was an entirely different song at first. I think he wrote several different songs that went over top of it.
Yeah, Paul's longtime engineer from going back to the Columbia days, a guy named Roy Heigl, or Halley, told Sound on Sound in 2008, Paul certainly wasn't going to tell those guys what to play, but he's a master organizer. He's extremely smart, and he was great at determining which section would be nice as a bridge or chorus or an intro, while striking up friendships with the group members with whom he could communicate. These included the guitarist Ray Peary, who always had a wealth of stuff going on in his head. He was smart, he could tell what Paul liked, and he would just go into the little catalog in his mind and come up with something. Whenever Paul said, "What do you have, Ray?" the response would be, "Well, I have this." That's how the songs really evolved, Heigl continued. Paul has great musical ears, and when it came to sifting through all the material and deciding what to use, where to make edits, and how to shape things into a track, he had a lot of that in his head. He has an incredible mind, and there wasn't anything that he didn't make a mental note of while listening to the musicians play their grooves.
Yeah, we'll get to this later, but there's a story of when they were recording the basic track for the song Graceland, and Ray starts playing and he moves to a minor chord, which Paul said was unusual for the kind of music he'd been hearing them play or hearing Ray play. And he asked Ray later, like, what made you do that chord? And Ray said, well, I'm imitating the kind of music that you do, like the kind of American folk stuff that you play. So yeah, he's a real MVP of these sessions, Ray Peary. Paul described the sessions in South Africa as, for the most part, euphoric. That's his words, except for, you know, apartheid. uh, he told NPR in 2012, in the middle of the euphoric feeling in the studio, you would have reminders that you're living in an incredibly tense racial environment where the law of the land was apartheid. And the black musicians would have to leave around sundown so they could be bussed back to their township as required by law. After dark, they were prohibited from riding public transport or even being in the street in Johannesburg after curfew. And there was a moment when Paul was in the middle of recording what would become Gumboots when the sax player packed up his instrument at 5 o'clock because he could be arrested if they found him in town. And Paul told Rolling Stone in 1986, there was a surface tranquility, but right below the surface was all this tension. And there was a story that he told in the Under African Skies documentary where the Boyoyo boys were having a hard time nailing a part that Paul wanted. And Paul was getting visibly frustrated. And one of the white engineers at the studio leaned over and kind of elbowed him and said, see, this is what we're talking about. They can't do it. They'll tell you they can, but they can't. So that's not great. Not great, Bob.
Speaking of the studio, one of the biggest knocks against Graceland is that it sounds dated, particularly to the mid-'80s, and probably the best example of that is the drum sound on this record, which is a choice. It is very funny to me to conceptually have these quote-unquote lo-fi, quote-unquote authentic sounds, like to be like, oh, I want to get like the most authentic, like African, playing musicianship possible. And then to be like, but I want the drums to sound like Phil Collins. And that is exactly what he does. The sound on this record of those drums, as we mentioned earlier, one of the first things you hear on this record is the drum sound of the 80s, gated reverb. It's a little difficult to explain, but you will, if you hear it, and there's all kinds of
punch in. I can punch in the opening of The Boy in the Bubble.
So what that is, and this is so fascinating, and this became it. You hear it on In the Air Tonight. It's probably one of the most famous because that song is like 75% drums, but also on Let's Dance, as I mentioned, Hounds of Love. It was huge on all the hair metal records, and it was a mistake. It was a complete and utter mistake, and you can blame Phil Collins and Peter Gabriel and a producer named Hugh Padgham. Phil Collins was drumming on a Peter Gabriel song that would become the song Intruder. And there was a solid state logic console that they had that was new at the time. It was a new console and it had a multi-channel compressor that was built into it. And a compressor is a piece of musical technology that essentially takes quiet sounds and makes them louder and takes loud songs and makes them quieter. It's a gross oversimplification, but that's essentially what it does. It's how you get a more even, consistent tone from instruments, vocals for recording purposes in studios. And previously you had to patch that technology in one channel at a time. And with the advances at the time in digital technology, this console that they were using was one of the first ones that could just apply compression to every input channel. And what happened was the way that it was built, it also had it applied to the talkback channel. When you're recording in a studio, a talkback mic is a mic that is in the live room that feeds back into the control room so that the musicians can talk in the live room while they're recording or in between takes, and people in the control room can hear it because in a normal situation, those rooms are separated and soundproofed. So the compression, because the way that this console was built, the compression was also applied to the talkback mic because the thinking was, oh, well, if the musicians are in like opposite corners of the room and someone is talking from one corner of the room and his voice is very quiet, we need the compression to make it as loud as someone who's physically closer to the mic. So what happened was Phil Collins was talking on this and then suddenly started playing drums without telling Hugh Padgham, I'm going to play the drums now, turn off the talkback mic. And when they heard the way that the drums sounded through this talkback mic and through this specific digital compression, they all flipped because it made the acoustic sound of these drums suddenly huge and really in your face and really amplified. And the console wasn't even set up to record from the talkback mic. This guy Hugh Padgett had to mod it to be able to record from that. And then he added a noise gate, which is another device. And what a noise gate does is it cuts off all signal below a certain threshold. So the sound that you're hearing there is a very, very loud attack, the initial boom of the drum, of whatever the acoustic signal is, and then very little of the acoustic decay that would naturally follow in a room. Now, the other half of the gated reverb sound is another specific piece of technology that, as all things must, can come back to Prince. Prince was his drum sound was enormously influential on stuff like Dirty Mind and Sign of the Times, but there's a very specific combination that he used, which was the Linn drum machine, Roger Linn, into a digital reverb box called the AMS RMX16. Now, that digital reverb box had a number of settings, presets that you could use. Small hall, spring reverb, plate reverb, large hall. And one of the presets was something called non-linear reverb. And what that means is that normal reverb decays the longer it goes on, right? Because in the true sense of reverberation, there is less sound reverberating in a space. So it's going to get quieter. Non-linear flips that. So it actually gets louder as it starts off with a quiet sound and actually gets louder if you look at the waveform. And Prince's staff engineer at the time was a woman named Susan Rogers. And she's one of the people who was an architect of this sound. She now teaches at Berkeley. She describes the effect of having this noise gate, having this very compressed drum sound, and having non-linear reverb on it as a tidal wave, an enormous tidal wave of sound that suddenly stops. You hear it on these early 80s things, and then it became just kind of the drum sound of the 80s. You heard it on all these pop records, hair metal, and then when the 90s rolled around and Nirvana killed all of those people, the trend immediately came back to swung back around, largely thanks to Steve Albini, to very dry drum production. Very, very dry, natural sounding, just the sound of a drum set in a small room. And the other big swing around that was hip-hop producers going back to old crate soul samples. So you basically started hearing acoustic drum sounds on stuff again.
James Brown stuff.
Yeah, directly from like Beastie Boys, like Paul's Boutique. Those were drum samples as opposed to being like a Linn drum or a DM, like an Oberheim or one of those MIDI's drum machines that you hear on like Rock the Bells, like like some of the Def Jam stuff is very drum machine heavy. And then it came back around, as all things must. Like you start hearing Heim and Jack, the stuff that Jack Antonoff loves a gated snare, loves gated reverb. So you have heard that sound start to come around, but it is, yes, instantly screams 80s. Sorry, I went on a long rant there just as you were about to say, I have something to say about that.
Oh, no. I mean, you know what? I mean, first of all, I hate that sound. So
Well, it's deeply unnatural. That's what's so interesting to me about it.
It's cold. It literally makes me feel cold.
Yeah.
There's like something about it that's just,
but that's why it's so revolutionary. Is you hear these guys who were like, the sound of their entire musical life had been like wood drums in a room. And then if you get bored with that and you're suddenly like, I want to reinvent the way that drums are literally conceived of and heard, you can imagine flipping over hearing like that, those Prince records or something like this and being like, what is that? Like dubstep or like how we it's the shock of the new. It just immediately became very overused. Yes.
Well, I mean, you questioned why Paul would use something that really screamed pop, dance pop, when he went all the way to Africa to try to get the most authentic sounds for these records. I think that he wanted it to be a blend. I mean, I think he
Mm.
wanted it like so much of I don't think he wanted to do a field recordings type of album. I think he wanted to show that there were connections between these types of music that wouldn't have been obvious, and that's why we'll get to later when he made Zydeco recordings and recorded with Los Lobos, who had kind of a Mexican Southwestern influence of sounds. He wanted to show the connection between all these unlike genres of music. So I think that was, and you called it a choice earlier in a way that was sort of meant to be sarcastic, but I think that there was a choice. I think that was the reason why he did it. I think that it was added the most modern cutting edge element that he possibly could at that time to try to make something new. I mean, it seems like the kind of thing that not so much with the gated drums, but a lot of the stuff that David Byrne was doing around then too. It was
Sure.
more of a
Yeah, yeah,
blend.
yeah, yeah. He did get Adrian. The common factor there is Adrian Belew coming in to
Yeah.
make stupid guitar sounds.
Adrian Belew played the riff on "You Can Call Me Al," which is next to those big gated drum sounds. Is probably the other most 80s sound
Yeah.
on this whole record. Because that's a guitar playing a stack synth. Well, needless to say, Paul Simon felt somewhat relieved by the time he left South Africa. In about 2 weeks, he returned with rough tracks for what would ultimately become Graceland, The Boy in the Bubble, I Know What I Know, Gumboots, Crazy Love Volume 2, and I believe You Can Call Me Al. Accounts vary when that one was started. He holed up at Manhattan's Hit Factory Studios with certain key members of the African groups he was recording with, including the aforementioned guitarist Ray Peary, bassist Bakithi Kumalo, and the drummer Isaac Michali. And they fleshed out the tracks together. And Paul made a point of flying these musicians first class, having them picked up by white limo drivers, and booking them into top-rate hotels and getting them meals at five-star restaurants. In the documentary we keep mentioning, Under African Skies, he tells the story of the musicians wanting to go see Central Park, and they asked Paul where to go to get a permit to go there. And Paul, somewhat tearfully, told them, you don't need a permit. You just go, which is actually a very sweet, touching moment. And then Paul decided to take a quick trip to Colonialism HQ, London. He went to record with, Ladysmith Black Mambazo, the legendary South African a cappella choir. The group's name comes from the town of Ladysmith, South Africa. And Paul had first seen them in a 1979 BBC documentary called Rhythm of Resistance, The Music of South Africa. But he didn't really dive into them until he made his journey to South Africa. And while he was there, he couldn't get enough. He listened to their tapes over and over. He said he used to fall asleep listening to them during his stay in South Africa. But adorably, he said he was too shy to actually call them to invite them to work together when he was recording there. And he explained in the Under African Skies documentary, I was bewitched by Ladysmith Black Mambazo because they were so beautiful. The music was enchanting. It was all a cappella, and it was so beautiful that I was intimidated. They were so good at what they did, and it was so contained that I didn't know at the time how I could possibly fit into their world. But eventually, someone associated with Ovation Studios put in the call to Ladysmith's leader, Joseph Shabalala, to come as a guest to one of the final Johannesburg sessions. And Joseph and Paul got on like a house on fire. Paul somewhat sheepishly asked if he could write Ladysmith Black Mambazo a song and send it to them and see if they were interested in collaborating on it. No strings attached. He said they could change it however they wanted, and if they didn't want to do it, that was fine with him. Joseph Shabalala said yes, and the men embraced, and he later said that it was the first time that he had ever hugged a white man, which is also very sweet, and it's very touching. Their relationship would become very close, so close that Paul would produce Ladysmith's first album from Warner Brothers, 1987's Shaka Zulu, which won a Grammy for Best Traditional Folk Recording. Paul went back to America, and in the summer of 1985, he wrote the song that would become Homeless. He sent a very simple piano demo to Joseph, encouraging him to change it however he saw fit. And they collaborated it, mixing in Paul's vocals with their own piece that was based around a Zulu wedding tune. But when it came time to record, Paul decided he just couldn't handle another trip to Johannesburg. He said basically the vibes were too heavy. So they decamped to Abbey Road Studios in London in October of 1985. But when they actually got into the studio, something wasn't working. it just wasn't coming together. The track just wasn't coming together. And this really upset Ladysmith Black Mambazo because, like so many of their comrades in South Africa, they were used to recording upwards of 10 songs a day. And the fact that they couldn't nail one was really hard for them. So, completely by their own accord, these singers went back to their hotel and they worked until after midnight to revise their part of the song. They changed the lyrics to something that they thought would better fit with Paul's homeless theme. And they sang about people living in caves on the side of a mountain, cold and hungry, using their fists as pillows. And they practiced until late into the night. And by the next morning, when they returned to the studio, they had this perfect blend of two songs from two cultures. And to their absolute delight and complete surprise, because this was a very close knit group, Paul actually went into the studio with them and joined them around the microphone to sing his delicate vocal takes. And Joseph later said, I nearly fainted. I'm thinking, who is this guy? He's my brother. Why is he hiding himself in America? I call him brother. I find that very touching.
Yeah, it's very cute.
I love Joseph Shabalala. I think he died a few years back, which is very sad that he's an incredible musician. And Paul gave Joseph a credit on Homeless as well as on Diamonds on the Soles of Her Shoes, which we'll talk about a little later. That was a late addition to the track listing. He also gave the accordion player Ferrari Motlo Hialoa a credit on The Boy in the Bubble. He gave General M.D. Sharinda credit on I Know What I Know, and members of the Boyoyo Boys credit on Gumboots. This was the re-recorded version of the instrumental track that Paul first heard on the bootleg cassette tape from Heidi Berg and sent this whole African adventure into motion in the first place. And this type of music is traditionally a favorite of miners and railway workers, and that's why the title is Gumboots. It refers to the heavy boots that they wear on the job. And hilariously, Paul wasn't all that happy with the Boyoyo Boys when he recorded with them, and he later said that the only reason the song Gumboots made the cut for the album was because this was the song that got him hooked on this genre of music, and it felt wrong to not include it. He later told Song Talk, if it wasn't that Gumboots led me into the whole project, I would have dropped Gumboots from the album, because I think it's the weakest link of the South African cuts. And as he did with all the South African tracks, Simon gave writing credits to the original writers of the song. And in total, that's 5 out of the 11 tracks on Graceland that he split credit for, which was very important to him to show that he wasn't just going to Africa and plundering their music solely for his own personal gain. And in fact, the only Graceland musicians to openly accuse Paul Simon of plagiarism were Americans. The last 2 tracks on the Graceland track list, they bucked the South African theme. Paul knew after coming back from Johannesburg that he needed to have a few more songs to pad out the album. He attended a Louisiana Cajun music showcase at Carnegie Hall, and while listening to the music, he noticed a similarity between the accordion-centric township music he was making and the zydeco sounds of the Gulf Shore. And he thought this could be a really cool thematic link between these two cultures. And like he said in the Under African Skies documentary, that's really the secret to world music. People are able to listen to each other and make associations and play their own music that sounds like it fits into another culture. So Paul and Roy Halley made a trip to Louisiana and they recorded the track for what became That Was Your Mother in a small studio behind a music store with a Zydeco band called Good Rockin' Doopsie and the Twisters. I can't get enough of that name. It all seemed to go fine until Graceland was a hit, by which point Rockin' Doopsie demanded co-writing credit and royalties on That Was Your Mother. If you listen closely, you can hear certain similarities in chord structure and the accordion passages to a Zydeco song called My Baby She's Gone, which is registered to one Alton Rubin Sr., a.k.a. Rockin' Doopsie. Just going to keep on saying Rockin' Doopsie as much as I can.
Hashtag Rockin' Doopsie.
Yes. Now, I've seen 2 explanations for why this case was dropped. One was that Paul Simon's lawyers hired a Cajun music scholar to look into this claim and found it bogus. Or 2, Good Rockin' Doopsie decided that the exposure was all the payment he needed and decided not to make any further claim. I call that the old intern exploitation excuse.
Yeah, Zydeco is really fascinating. I mean, aside from the fact that there's obviously the similarities between the accordion music and the stuff that you hear in some township music, Zydeco is wild because nobody has any idea where that word actually comes from, depending on who you ask.
Oh.
It's either like a bowdlerization of a French word for green beans, like a proverb, les haricots sont something, which means like the green beans aren't salted, which is like a proverb that they would say like, well, times are hard, like les haricots, blah, blah, blah. And it was transmuted into Zydeco. But There are also scholars who think that it comes from some phonemes that you hear in different African languages that are tied to singing and dancing. And that part of, I mean,
Oh.
this is why I'm obsessed with like New Orleans culture and stuff, because it is so purely syncretic. I mean, you get French Creole culture, you get coming from Haiti and that part of the African diaspora, but then you obviously get all the stuff from the slave trade, and then you get like the Acadians, and Zydeco is so fascinating in that regard, especially the way that they kind of conceive of where their beats fall. Like one you mentioned feeling like
Hmm.
off kilter, the way that those accordions work. That's something that you see in music that's based kind of around the clave pattern, because you can think of different beats as interchangeable because of the way that they're all based on repeating 2-bar patterns. And you hear that with like some Zydeco music, when with like some of their fiddle reels and some of the accordion stuff, you can basically hear how different parts of it can come in on the offbeat, the upbeats or the downbeats, and it still squares out the same. It's just endlessly interesting to me. You can cut all that.
Oh, I love that. Wow. I feel like you should do the Los Lobos, because I don't know, for some reason I just feel like you would have a
Oh,
lot to
I
say
love
on
Los
this.
Lobos. They're great. I don't really think they've ever really gotten their due, man. I mean, the other group that accused Paul Simon of plagiarism was Los Lobos, who are long running, incredibly long running LA rock band. They are Mexican American, and they had just come off of their probably their biggest album, How Will the Wolf Survive, which was voted the third best album of 1984. Was this the Paz and Jop poll?
I think so.
Yeah, that just behind Born in the USA and Purple Rain. And at Warner Brother chief Lenny Waronker's, what is it? Waronker? Waronker?
Moronker?
Waronker? Lenny Waronker. At Warner Brothers chief Lenny Waronker's recommendation, Paul Simon got in touch with them after the collaboration with Good Rockin' Doopsie, uh, because it felt like a good fit. Accordions, why not? But they did not get along. They were like already a big band. They were a big
Yeah, yeah.
regional band, and this record, How Will the Wolf Survive, had kind of broken them wider. And they didn't like the fact that Simon approached the session the same way that he approached the ones in South Africa, where he basically said, well, let's jam. Los Lobos band leader Steve Berlin said in 2008, we go into the studio, and he had quite literally nothing. No ideas, no concepts, and said, well, let's just jam. One full day of playing yielded very little, but he did take a guitar part on the second day, Paul Simon, that he liked, which supposedly the crux of Los Lobos' issue is that that was a song that they were working on independently. And that guitar part became All Around the World, or The Myth of Fingerprints. According to Berlin, what they played in that studio that day is exactly what ended up on the record. And so, because Paul had credited the African musicians that he worked with, Los Lobos assumed they would also be credited. This did not happen. They were not. Are they? They're still not on there.
Yeah, no, they're not on there now, and this Steve Berlin guy is still pissed about it. He's quoted as saying, "It was not a pleasant deal for us. I mean, he quite literally, and in no way do I exaggerate when I say he stole the song from us." And he claims that he brought the matter to Paul's attention, and he was met with the less than conciliatory response of, "Sue me, see what happens." And Steve Berlin holds a grudge to this day, dubbing Paul Simon, quote, "the world's biggest prick." Simon, however, disagrees. He says that it was a case of opportunism after the album became a huge hit. He's quoted as saying, "The album came out and we heard nothing. Then 6 months passed and Graceland had become a hit, and the first thing I heard about the problem was when my manager got a lawyer's letter. I was shocked." So that was the story of the music on Graceland, but there was still a lot of work to be done to shape these recordings into what you hear on the record. Like we said earlier, this was just raw material with no melody in mind yet, and in a sense, Graceland was edited together not unlike a film, and the process was long and very laborious. As engineer Roy Halley said, the task was enormous. There were no songs, no arrangements. We were looking at months of editing, taking things from here on a track, putting them there, take this out, and recopying things. Paul had to turn the tracks into songs, and he had to put words to each one. And in fact, Paul said that he considered putting the record out just as it was. Quote, because you can't do any better than this. Anything I put on here now will just make it worse. So it took a while before I had the courage to write over these tracks. And the process was a challenge since, they're extremely busy tracks, and finding holes for the words was very difficult. If you'll allow us our hashtag Rick Beato corner, we'll let Paul explain. It was very difficult because patterns that seemed as though they should fit together often didn't. I realized that in African music, the rhythms are always shifting slightly, and that the shape of a melody was often dictated by the bass line rather than the guitar. Harmonically, African music consists of essentially three major chords. That's why it sounds so happy. So I could write almost any melody I wanted in a major scale. And Paul walked around carrying a legal pad in which he jotted lyrics starting in, I think, the summer of 1985. And Paul, as you can probably imagine, was something of a perfectionist, which meant that there are many cases where he just rewrote songs over and over and over again. I think that's what ended up happening with The Boy in the Bubble. And also songs like Graceland, they took something like 3 to 4 months a piece to write. I think others like All Around the World and Crazy Love came together slightly quicker, but still, it was a tough task.
Yeah, and he is wrong. There are minor chords in African music. I think the other quote that I read from this specifically was that in the township stuff and some of the harmonic stuff, like he was saying like I would try and get Ladysmith Black Mambazo to sing like minor chords, and they couldn't do
Just
it.
don't hear it.
Yeah, like the tonality is different there, but that statement is not really correct. But he is right about the rhythmic stuff, and that's really interesting because drum set, the trap set is like a recent invention when you compare it to the scope of African music, right? So, and neither is the electric bass or electric guitar. So, a lot of this stuff evolved from um, having multiple percussion instruments being played, like shakers and hand claps, being transported over to the drum set, and a lot of the
Hmm.
interlocking patterns that you actually hear in high life music or in township music is what you're hearing is guys who took and learned melodic patterns from thumb pianos, and they
Mm.
would split up the treble and bass parts of like a thumb piano of these interlocking repeated rhythmic ostinatos that you hear in thumb piano mbira music. And so the really trebly jangly guitar parts are the treble side of like the melody side, and then someone would take the bass part and put that on bass guitar. So that's why the one of the reasons that the music is so complex is that first of all it comes from drumming first music, and second of all it's basically they were taking centuries of oral and rhythmic vocal music and percussive music and transmuting it onto 20th century instruments. And then the other thing that I read that his engineer did was he was like, "Yeah, I threw a bunch of like rhythmic delays on everything, so that's why the bass lines are crazy on that. Is because you're actually hearing like like slapback delay and time based delay effects on bass guitar, which you really never." Never are supposed to do, but because he's such a tremendous bass player and he's playing fretless and the bass lines are so vocal, it almost comes across as a cappella music. You hear him, it sounds like somebody
Mm.
singing bass register parts, but it is very slippery, as any bassist who's tried to learn those will tell you.
Was that by Keithy Kamala? Yeah.
And he, as I mentioned earlier, was like a big fusion guy. I mean, he talked about loving like Weather Report and listening to like upright bassists, and this was back before like fretless electric basses were really such a thing, like really manufactured. I mean, the guy who's probably most famous for playing fretless electric bass is Jaco Pastorius, and he really legitimized the electric bass as far as jazz goes. Like everyone was like, "Oh, you have to play upright to play bass," and he basically pried the frets out of a Fender jazz bass with like a putty knife and threw a bunch of boat epoxy on the fretboard because he lived in Florida and created like a fretless electric bass out of it and got these really beautiful singing sustained tones on it. And then everybody who heard him like flipped their shit, and that's when you start hearing it become a popular thing in fusion, and then it also kind of crosses into the pop world. Pino Palladino is like one of the most
Mm.
famous like jazz like session bassists of all time. He played fretless on a bunch of stuff in the 80s. You hear fretless bass on a lot of stuff on Kate Bush's stuff. And Bekithi is his intonation is perfect, and that's one of the things that Roy talks about in the Sound on Sound article. He's like, "Oh, that dude had like the best ear I've ever heard from a bassist." Like that was part of the reason he said he could get away with doing like reverb and delay on stuff, was because his pitch was so perfect on that instrument that he could throw in these time based processing and it didn't make it sound like out of tune. Yeah, great. Just oh god, I can't talk enough about the bass on this record. It's so insane. I mean, just that. Yeah,
The little run on Diamonds on the Soles of Her Shoes.
it's incredible. Or even just like the way that he throws in like it doesn't sound like it just doesn't sound like any other kind of bass playing. You know, like
No.
just
You
throwing
Can
like
Call Me Al, the little like wah, well, yeah.
just what's a boom. Wah, wah. Like he does these big sliding octaves that it
Yeah.
sounds like horns. It sounds like a low brass section. This is really incredible stuff. Anyway, Beato.
Well, well, back to the lyrics. Paul Simon got a lot of flack for not making Graceland his soapbox and writing lyrics that spread awareness of the human rights violations in South Africa. And Paul opted not to do this for several reasons. The first and most pragmatic of which is that he felt he was a subpar political songwriter. Introspection and relationships were more his thing. He said, "I don't think I'm a very good angry songwriter."
That is funny because American Tune, one of my favorite songs of his, is just him being depressed. Was it George McGovern that George McGovern lost?
Yeah.
Instead of writing something political, he's just like, I'm sad now.
He also didn't want to make this his soapbox record because he didn't want to risk coming across as preachy, if he tried to go the Bob Dylan, Bob Geldof route. And he thought that would be a turnoff to listeners. And he explained this position in the Under African Skies documentary. He said, "Are you going to get up there and say, I have incredible indignation with the sin of apartheid? Well, that's fine if you can say it musically. And if you can't say it musically, it's a flop because no one's going to want to listen to you." That's the old, you get more flies with honey approach, I guess. He wanted to write his best songs, and if the songs were good enough, they'd raise awareness in a much more subtle but potent way. He explicitly said he didn't want to write the kind of song that Peter Gabriel did with Biko, which was, a very good yet overtly political song about South Africa. And Peter Gabriel himself praised Graceland, saying it did more to, quote, help people around the world know that there was more to Africa than suffering. Which is a good quote. And Paul wanted his album to, in his words, touch on the part of the culture where people laughed and life was being celebrated. And finally, Paul said that he didn't want to go political because he thought it wasn't his place and that it would be arrogant to do so. He said, "The most sincere expression of my respect for these musicians was not to go and stand up and say, 'Let me describe your plight and your burden. I'll do that for you.' My idea was, they play their best, I'll play my best. They didn't say, 'Come in here and tell our story.' They just said, 'Yeah, you can come in. We'll play with you.'" But still, upon the release of Graceland in 1986, many people criticized Paul Simon for not addressing apartheid in his lyrics, to which he responded, this is kind of great, "Was I supposed to solve things in a song?" I mean, we could debate the endlessly complicated issues around this all day, but to sum up, I'd like to quote this line from Paul that seems to articulate his reasoning. "I still think it's the most powerful form of politics, more powerful than saying it right on the money, in which case you're usually preaching to the converted. People get attracted to the music, and once they hear what's going on within it, they say, 'What? They're doing that to these people?'"
Yeah, I mean, he's right. Bono was wrong. Rock and roll did not change the world. Like, I'm sorry. It didn't. The world's still a nightmare. I don't know. It's interesting. It's really interesting. There's so much in there about like, did he empower the guys to come over to have music careers? I mean, certainly Bekithi seems to think so. A lot of these other guys think so, but I do think, it would have been a much worse record if it was apartheid is really bad. Apartheid is really bad. Boom 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 boom. Man walks down the street. Apartheid's bad.
Show me your papers now.
Boom 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 boom.
It's a highlight of this episode. The only line that Paul said that he'd written in South Africa was reportedly from The Boy in the Bubble. And those lines were, "The way the camera follows us in slow-mo, the way we look to us all." Which kind of sums up his feelings of being in Johannesburg. A very paranoid line, I feel like. Amusingly, Paul spent a long time working on drafts of the lyrics to The Boy in the Bubble, only to realize that he'd given his best ideas away to Philip Glass for a project they were working on together. So he went to his buddy Phil and asked for his lyrics back, which he promptly got, despite the fact that Philip Glass already had written music around Paul Simon's words. We got to have like a tally of Paul Simon being a dick on one column and Paul Simon being right on the other. But as you pointed out at the beginning of the episode, those are not mutually exclusive, but good God.
I just love the going back to, it's like when Jeff Beck died, I was reading about how he wrote Superstition with Stevie Wonder.
Oh yeah.
And Stevie Wonder was like, actually, that one's mine. And Jeff Beck was like, what are you talking about? I want that song. Or we wrote that together. That was a writing session for me. And Stevie Wonder was like, no. And because I record everything myself and at like all hours of the night, he got his version out first and then gave Jeff Beck an inferior song. Song's still good because we've ended as lovers. But
Jeff Beck did end up doing it though, right? It
Yeah,
might have
he
been
did.
on Beck Bogert a piece.
Well, the story is that because Beck was such a perfectionist, he took so long to like go over his solos and stuff that it basically just took too long. Stevie was like recorded it in like a day and got his version out first, and Jeff Beck was supposedly pretty red-assed about that. But just imagining Paul Simon showing up to Philip Glass and was like, I need those back. To Philip Glass, fresh off Koyaanisqatsi, like Einstein on the beach, Philip Glass, and be like, Phil, I need that song back.
He did write him another one though.
Are we still on for stickball later?
Wiffle ball. I gotta beat Randy Newman.
I gotta beat Randy Newman. Will you help me beat Randy Newman? Mr. Philip Glass.
But yeah, he got his words back, and that's on the opening track, The Boy in the Bubble, and got the memorable line, "These are the days of miracle and wonder." That was reportedly the first song that he worked on in Africa, and he said he always knew it was going to be the opener because of that. He said earlier, that disorienting accordion sound goes a long way in signaling this new, to American listeners at least, sound, and those drums. It was like an announcement. You haven't heard this before. And the lyrics are very much at odds with the sound of the record. And it takes a tremendous amount of skill to mesh a line like "the boy in the bubble and the baby with the baboon heart" with African rhythms.
Incredible.
And that line, it's supposedly inspired, I assume, by the medical case of baby Faye, who was a little girl who underwent a heart transplant soon after birth. Her case is sad, so I won't elaborate. And the title is thought to be inspired by the medical cases of David Vedder and Ted DeVita, who were heavily immunocompromised kids who had to live in a sterile bubble, essentially. And their story was later dramatized in the 1976 made-for-TV movie The Boy in the Plastic Bubble, starring John Travolta, which is what got him the role in Grease.
And also 2001's Bubble Boy, starring Jake Gyllenhaal, which is what got him the role in Donnie Darko. No, I'm kidding. I thought this was a specific incident, so I Googled it, and there were actually 2 incidences of bombs in baby carriages making international news that might have inspired Paul Simon, at least that are online. One was a 1972 in Belfast, and the other, and this is the one that I'm willing to bet money on, was January of 1985. So the timing is sort of works out. In West Germany. But neither of those news articles, one was from the AP and the other was from, I think, New York Times, mentioned a radio, though. So still up in the air. If you or a loved one knows which radio Paul Simon was referencing, we'll Venmo you $5.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Too Much Information in just a moment. Now we're going to talk about the title track, Graceland. And as we mentioned earlier, the backing track came from a jam that was done in Johannesburg, but the only thing that Paul liked was the Sun Records style traveling rhythm played by VC Kumalo, the drummer. And it reminded him of this country rockabilly Johnny Cash style shuffle. No doubt sowing the seeds for the Elvis connection that I have nothing to drum on.
The train beat, they call that.
Can you do it? You got harder things to drum on.
No, it's like a recognized. No, I'm not going to do that. No, it's like the country. It's like the classic country beat.
Yeah.
But it's supposed to sound like a train going by.
Oh, yeah. So Paul kept the drum pattern and played it for guitarist Ray Perry, who added some chords over top. And we had mentioned this earlier. What was unusual is that he used a minor chord, which is not unheard of, but uncommon in genres of South African music. And he told Paul that it was the type of chord change that he'd heard in Paul's own music. So he was just imitating him. So that's cool. You get some American, South African cross-cultural exchange happening. And Paul would say the track for Graceland is a mixture of the two musical worlds, not something that was an intellectual decision, but an organic experience. And he rounded out the rhythm section with drummer Isaac Mishali and bassist Bagithi Kumalo, plus a steel guitar overdub from guitarist Demola Adepoju. And the track reminded Paul of these early rock songs that he loved so much. He later said, the track has a beautiful emptiness to it. That's what made me think of Sun Records when there was nothing but slapback echo in the song. It's a song about commonalities, in this case between music, which is ironic because it's a song about his imploding relationship with Carrie Fisher. They were married in 1983 and divorced a year later, but had an on-again, off-again relationship throughout the rest of the decade. And Carrie Fisher would later tell Rolling Stone that Graceland, quote, has part of us in it. And she's confirmed that lines like, she's come back to tell me she's gone, as if I didn't know that, as if I didn't know my own bed, as if I'd never noticed the way she brushed her hair from her forehead, refer to her. She confirmed that she had a habit of brushing her hair from her forehead. And Paul talked about the she's come back to tell me she's gone line in the Robert Hilburn book, saying, it's half funny, but it's also heartbreaking about how hard it is to break up. It's as if she's telling me something I don't know, as if I don't know my own empty bed. And then, of course, there's the crucial line of the song, losing love is like a window to your heart. Everybody sees you're blown apart. And Paul later said, when that came out, I thought someone had punched me in the heart. I just lost my breath. I just sat down. But at the same time, that part of my brain that's a songwriter thinks, that's good. May we all have such a great outlet for our most heartbreaking thoughts.
Or the tremendous ability to emotionally compartmentalize your trauma.
Yeah. It's probably no coincidence that the B-side to the Graceland single was Hearts and Bones, which was the title track of Paul's previous record, which explored the breakup in an even more stark, emotionally bleak terms. Do you know that song is just devastating?
It's tough.
Why can't you love me for who I am, where I am? Because that's not the way the world is, baby. This is how I love you, baby. That's a hell of a line. Thankfully, Carrie Fisher admitted that she felt honored and privileged to be a part of Paul Simon's music, but not all the lines were actually about her. One of my favorite lines in this song, one that's vexed fans for decades, is, there's a girl in New York City who calls herself the human trampoline. Turns out, it doesn't really mean anything. Paul explained to Song Talk magazine, that line came to me when I was walking past the Museum of Natural History. For no reason I can think of. It's not related to anybody or anything. It just struck me as funny.
I always thought that was like slut shaming or something.
Yeah, I kind of did too. I always thought there was some, yeah.
Paul worked really hard on the lyrics to this extremely wordy song, adjusting the phrasing in a variety of different ways. And the section that he worked on the longest was the chorus. For a time, the working line for that was driving through wasteland, which he ultimately changed to going to Graceland. He was working for a long time under the assumption that Graceland would be a placeholder because he didn't have any intention of making the song an actual tribute to Elvis, but he couldn't get the phrase out of his head, and he decided to not only keep the line, but also make an actual pilgrimage to Graceland to, quote, see if there was something the song was telling me. So after recording the Zydeco track that became That Was Your Mother in Louisiana in the spring of '85, Paul drove up Highway 61, hence the line, the Mississippi Delta was shining like a national guitar, which was first shining like a bottleneck guitar, then shining like an open-tuned guitar, and then finally shining like the National guitar, which is the all-metal resonator model that famously around this time would have seen on the cover of the Dire Straits record Brothers in Arms.
Yeah.
I am following the river down the highway through the cradle of the Civil War. I'm going to Graceland in Memphis, Tennessee. Paul Simon loved singing Memphis, Tennessee because it reminded him of a Chuck Berry song. And when he arrived at Graceland, he got no VIP treatment because he hadn't told anyone that he was coming. So he was literally waiting in line, hence the line, poor boys and pilgrims with families. He admitted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that the visit left him singularly unimpressed until you finish the tour and you come outside and there's Elvis's grave and it said, Elvis Presley, whose music has touched millions of people around the world. And I read it and I just started to cry. I just thought it's really true. This guy who was loved by everybody. Being in the crowds at Graceland, it's almost like a religious thing about Elvis. So the song started to write itself. It became a narrative. It became about this father and son journey to mend a broken heart, and Graceland became like a metaphor. He had embarked on a physical journey to collect ideas in Africa, and he would spiritually journey home to the rock forefather to revitalize his love for music. And it's funny that he also had harmony singing forefathers, the Everly Brothers, singing on this song. Obviously a huge inspiration to anyone who sang harmony following them, particularly Simon and Garfunkel. Their first group was, when they were called Tom and Jerry, was essentially just Everly Brothers rips.
Oh, yeah. They used to get Everly Brothers records and go home to their bedroom and practice together. And they would sing right next to each other. And they would look into each other's open mouths and study their tongue placement on their palate of their mouths to try to get their voices to blend almost like a family. You know, they say that a lot of family singers can blend in ways that most people can't. That's why you got the Beach Boys. They're, three brothers and a cousin, because certain minor ways that families have the same speech patterns, it lends itself to having that perfect singing blend. And it sounds like they got that artificially.
I always wanted to know if that was the Talking Heads referenced that, because there's that line in Naive Melody where he says, sing into my mouth.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe. That's a great question.
I don't know. David Byrne's a weirdo. So maybe. The part about traveling with his young son, Harper, who's the child from his first marriage, is a bit of dramatic, poetic license. To hear Paul Simon describe it, he sort of figured out the meaning of the song as he wrote it, and it revealed itself to him line by line. He said, this is a search for something, and there's been a breakup. Eventually, I understood that the song is about why we are traveling to Graceland, to find out how to get healed. That's why I named the album Graceland. It seemed to be about finding something that you could call a state of grace, the healing of a deep wound. And that's what was going on in South Africa. There was a deep wound, and then an attempted healing process. But his son was not in the car with him.
That's so good, though. I mean, for somebody who's going through, a personal romantic crisis, and using that as a jumping off point.
Yeah.
To then, I mean, that's really good. That's why he's Paul Simon,
and you're not.
Chevy Chase hint.
Yeah, you said it's up there with The Boxer or American Tune, one of these songs that's an expression of hope that is also simultaneously unfathomably sad.
It's I mean, to me, it's the musical equivalent of Paul Newman and Cool Hand Luke getting beaten up and not staying down. And, the Boxer is maybe a little too on the nose with that, but
supposedly that line in the Talking Head song comes from David Byrne seeing Inuit throat singers who sing they sing face to face with people, with partners, so that each other's mouths can act as a resonating chamber, which he sure can't do post-COVID. Yeah, and in the Classic Albums documentary about it, a very deadpan Paul Simon says that's the best song I ever wrote, without a trace of joy in his delivery. But ever the perfectionist, he does say that there's one line he'd rewrite, which is and my traveling companions are ghosts and empty sockets. I'm looking at ghosts and empties. According to him, those are too many words.
So remember earlier in the episode when I talked about Lorne Michaels being the patron saint of Graceland, he introduced Heidi Berg to Paul, and she's the one who turned him on to South African music. Well, Lorne Michaels is also responsible pretty much directly for the creation of the standout track Diamonds on the Soles of Her Shoes, which was a last-minute addition to the album. Graceland was originally slated for release in the spring of 1986, and Lorne Michaels, who'd returned to SNL by this point, booked his friend Paul on SNL for a performance on May 10th, along with Ladysmith Black Mambazo, I would imagine making their American TV debut. But Warner Brothers, or at least Wenny Ronker, one day we'll get his name right.
This son of a bitch, Lenny.
And Mo Osteen, who ran Warner Brothers, they were both blown away by Graceland, and they pushed the release back to August instead of April to basically get more time to implement a bigger promotional strategy. So instead of canceling his SNL appearance, Lorne Michaels kept his buddy Paul on for that May to give people a taste of what would be coming on Graceland. And Lorne said he was a little nervous about the whole Ladysmith Black Mambazo thing. He apparently took Paul aside beforehand and asked, "You really think people are going to like this? I'm counting on you for that."
That's a good Lorne.
I was going to say, that wasn't bad. Yeah. I mean, think of Dr. Evil saying that. Thankfully, the performance was met with a rapturous response. In the Under African Skies documentary, Lorne referred to the occasion as, quote, a revolution in taste in the United States. It was the synthesis of two cultures and the obvious affection they had for Paul and that Paul had for them. It was the perfect moment. And Paul decided to capitalize on that energy and also take advantage of the fact that all the necessary players were in town by going to the Hit Factory recording studio about a week after their SNL performance. And he recalled thinking, well, we're all here. We might as well do another track. And that was pretty much the birth of Diamonds on the Soles of Her Shoes, which was apparently the first time the a cappella group Ladysmith Black Mambazo had ever sung with musicians. Paul worked it up with Ladysmith's leader, Joseph Shabalala, who contributed the opening Zulu refrain, which translates roughly to, "It's not unusual, but in our days, we've seen those things happen. They are women, they can take care of themselves." And it's essentially a comment on the independence of women in the modern age, which Paul did in his own way, detailing the relationship between the poor boy and the girl who was so rich that she had diamonds on the bottom of her shoes.
I thought that was about him and Carrie as well. Because not like he was poor at that point, but she was way richer than he was. She was Hollywood royalty. He was a 5'3" guy from Queens.
Well, yeah, but they got together in the late 70s after.
I know. But
maybe. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't put it past him. But the image might have been inspired by the township music's history as the music of migrant coal and diamond workers. And I'm also really intrigued by the possible double meaning in this song's title. On one hand, it could show that she's frivolous and spoiled, and she's got these incredibly expensive things that she can't even see just on the soles of her shoes. But also, diamonds are the hardest substance on earth, and they would make excellent shoe soles. So, in a way, it's almost a ruthlessly practical thing to do. So maybe it's like, something that, what good does a diamond do, really, when it's on your finger? It doesn't do anything. If it's on the soles of your shoes, at least it's being useful. So, I don't know. I also feel this way. My dad and I would get in a debate. It wasn't a debate because we both agreed. The 59th Street Bridge song, "Slow Down, You Move Too Fast. You need to make the morning or moment," I forget if it's morning or moment, last. We both always thought, don't slow down. You got to make the most of the moment. Speed up. Like, take it for all it's worth.
I hate that song. Feeling groovy.
Oh,
sorry.
Anyhow, Diamonds on the Soles of Her Shoes was a triumph, and Paul and Ladysmith Black Mambazo performed it during their second appearance on SNL on November 22nd, 1986, to wide acclaim. It is a truly joyous TV moment. It's hard to find online, which is kind of a bummer, but it's in the Under African Skies documentary.
I think all the SNL stuff is on Peacock.
Well then, I mean...
Because that's where I found Keith Jarrett's otherwise unpublished... As I have to, I'm bringing this back to Keith Jarrett. That's where I found Keith Jarrett's SNL performance,
Is it the full episode or is it the actual performance? Because
it's a full episode. Well, you have to. Sorry.
No. Okay.
I'm so sorry.
Well, you should watch this. November 22nd, 1986. Their version of Diamonds on the Soles of Her Shoes is just like it just is one of the most joyful musical performances I've ever seen on a TV show. It's so nice. It's up there for me with like, not in terms of historical importance necessarily, but in terms of seeing like the Beatles and Sullivan. They're just so happy, all of them. It's really sweet.
Graceland was released on August 25th, 1986. The cover art depicts a 16th century Ethiopian Christian icon from the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. Boy, There's a lot of stuff in there. A Salem, Mass art museum holding a piece of Ethiopian Christian art. Lot to unpack there. People
Just
could
down the
have
street from Hocus Pocus filming locations.
dissertations have been written on less. It was Paul Simon's first million-selling record since There Goes Rhymin' Simon in 1973. It went on to sell 14 million copies worldwide, won Album of the Year at the Grammys, and Record of the Year for the song Graceland in '88. The popularity was almost universal. Robert Christow's Village Voice review opened with, "Opposed though I am to universalist humanism, this is a pretty damn universal record." I like how you start that out with an intellectual one and then go Jeff Foxworthy and this is a pretty damn universal record. Within the democratic bounds of pop accessibility, its biculturalism is striking, engaging, unprecedented. Sprightly yet spunky, fresh yet friendly, so strange, so sweet, so willful, so radically incongruous and plainly beautiful. A. In the Voice's year-end poll of the U.S. pop critics, Graceland was voted the best album of 1986. And no less an authority than Joe Strummer told the LA Times shortly after its release, "I don't like the idea that people who aren't adolescents make records. Adolescents make the best records, except for Paul Simon, except for Graceland. He's hit a new plateau there, but he's writing to his own age group. Graceland is something new. That song to his son is just as good as Blue Suede Shoes. Before you were born, dude, when life was great. That's just as good as Blue Suede Shoes, and that is a new dimension." Rolling Stone was a little more subdued, with David Frick offering the passive-aggressive observation that Graceland had become, quote, "a daily soundtrack in urban yuppie condos and suburban living rooms and on radio airwaves from Australia to Zimbabwe." Much of the commercial success of the record, though, is thanks to Paul having scored his first MTV hit with "You Can Call Me Al."
I bet you were wondering when we were going to finally mention Al. I can't believe that we made it this far without really talking about You Can Call Me Al. That lead riff came from Stamela guitarist Ray Peary, though I've seen mixed reports about when they first started working on the song. But I believe it began as a jam during the Johannesburg sessions, and they finished it up in New York. And one of the producers at Ovation Studios supposedly told Paul the next day, "I think you recorded one of your hits yesterday." So it was clear early on that this song had potential. And I didn't realize this, but the parts that I assumed were saxes were actually a guitar synth played by Adrian Belew, who was known to me mostly for playing with David Bowie.
Well, it's funny because he's also on the Talking Heads record. I mean,
Yeah.
it's when is Remain in Light?
83?
80. Yeah. So
80? Is that early? Wow.
Remain in Light is arguably another touchstone in white people stealing African stuff. But Adrian Belew is also on that record. That is, I believe I was correct. That is the Roland G505 or GR300 guitar synth. It is a synth on there, but it does have real horns layered over it. I read in the Sound on Sound article. So,
but the coolest bit of studio trickery on Al is the slap bass solo played by Bakithi Kumalo, supposedly on his birthday, May 10th, which would have made it during the New York sessions. The thing that's cool about it, other than the fact that it whips, is that Paul loved the sound so much that he decided to artificially extend the solo by playing the tape backwards. So the result is a musical palindrome with one measure, the descending phrase, mirrored by the reverse ascending portion. I'll probably punch that in here. It was enormously effective and technically impossible to reproduce live exactly as heard on the record, which I think is cool. It's a very Beatley thing to do.
Doesn't stop people from trying, though.
Yeah.
You can see a boatload.
Can you play that?
No, I can't play a single one of these lines. I've tried.
So let's talk about the meaning of You Can Call Me Al, starting with the title. It stemmed from an incident that took place at a party Paul had attended years before with his then-wife, Peggy Harper. During the evening, they chatted with the French composer-conductor Pierre Boulez, and apparently this man was hard of hearing because as he prepared to make his exit, he tapped Paul on the shoulder and said, "I'm sorry I have to leave, Al, and give my best to Betty." And Paul found this faux pas extremely funny, and it became a running joke between the then couple. Peggy would call Paul Al, and he'd call Peggy Betty. The memory came back to Paul as he started writing the words to Ray Peary's riff, and the song overall is basically about a self-obsessed man in the midst of a midlife crisis and seeking purpose and redemption, and ultimately finding it and becoming more self-aware. It's not all that dissimilar to the themes of the song Graceland. In the documentary Under African Skies, he explained, "You Can Call Me Al is really the story of somebody like me who goes to Africa with no idea and ends up having an extraordinary spiritual experience." He then goes essentially line by line to explain the song, so allow me to paraphrase. It opens with something akin to an old vaudeville joke. A man walks down the street. It's an old setup. Guy walks into a bar. Man walks down the street. And he wonders, why am I soft in the middle? The rest of my life is so hard. It's wordplay. Don't want to end up a cartoon in a cartoon graveyard. He's writing about himself and how he doesn't want to be irrelevant and, in a way, fears death. The second verse is a variation on the first with another Borscht Belt style joke. Got a short span of attention. Got a short little span of attention. It's a dick joke, folks. Sorry. He's racked with fear. What if I die here? Who'll be my role model? And you're not supposed to have sympathy for this guy by the second verse, Paul said, because by this point he's had way too many complaints. And the chorus is essentially him talking to a woman, a partner. We'll make an alliance. I'll look out for you if you look out for me and guard against the things that we have to fear. And the verses, which had begun fairly straight at the beginning of the song, have started getting more and more abstract by verse 3. And as Paul himself explained during the Graceland episode of the Classic Albums documentary series, by the third verse, the lyrics have become abstract but autobiographical as he describes his journey to South Africa, where he had a spiritual experience. A man walks down the street. It's a street in a strange world. Maybe it's the third world. Maybe it's his first time around. He doesn't speak the language. He holds no currency. He's a foreign man. He's surrounded by the sound of cattle in the marketplace. Interesting to me that the more autobiographical he gets, the more abstract he feels he has to be. That's just an interesting insight into Paul Simon's psychology. But then he looks around and around and lets the experience move him. He sees angels in the architecture, spinning in infinity. And by that point, there's nothing left to say but amen and hallelujah. And the video for this song has become one of the most recognizable of the 80s. And once again, it's owed pretty much directly to Lorne Michaels. Paul used his time doing the SNL performance to make a video for You Can Call Me Al, which was the first single off of Graceland, but he wasn't happy with the result because it was basically just a boring performance clip of him on the Rockefeller Center stage. So Lorne played the song to Chevy Chase while they were hanging out on Long Island and suggested that Chevy do something for the video. And Paul and Chevy had been old friends since SNL launched in 1975. Paul, I think, was a guest on the second episode of SNL. I think that was the one where he reunited with Art Garfunkel, and I think he was in a bunch of sketches in that episode too. But Paul, in the early years of SNL, was a very familiar face. There's that great sketch of him. There's a video sketch of him playing basketball with, was it Julius Erving? I think it was Julius Erving. And it's so funny because Paul's like 5'2", 5'3". Have you never seen this?
No.
Oh, it's great. Oh no, it was a Harlem Globetrotter, Connie Hawkins. It's so funny. And they have the whistling Sweet Georgia Brown playing in the background and I think the whole joke is Paul Simon just schools this 7-foot tall guy. And then there's the one where he starts singing he sings something in a turkey costume.
Suit. Yeah. Was it still crazy?
That's a good. I think it's still crazy. I think you're right. Yeah. So yeah, Paul Simon and Chevy Chase go way, way back. So Lorne Michaels thought it would be funny to pair them for a video. And Lorne came up with the idea, along with director Gary Weiss, of having Chevy just ferociously lip-syncing the song while mugging and gesturing and basically doing everything in his power to steal the spotlight from Paul Simon, who looks on glumly, completely upstaged. And Paul himself had the idea of being the one to lug large instruments around in the room while Chevy mimed, which is medium funny. For me, the only thing funnier than Sad Paul is when they pick up the horns and start doing the Motown-style dance moves. The video is very funny. MTV put the video into heavy rotation, and the song eventually reached number 23 on the Hot 100. And when Paul played the huge New York City Central Park concert in 1991, Chevy joined him on stage to perform their horn dance from the video. So, if you're keeping score, Lorne Michaels is directly or indirectly responsible for turning Paul into South African music, getting Diamonds on the Soles of Her Shoes written, getting the You Can Call Me Al video made, and spreading the music to the masses with 2 highly rated performances on SNL in less than 6 months. So that's pretty crazy. Lorne Michaels, I hate to say it, kind of the MVP of Graceland.
Bold statement.
I know. It doesn't give me any pleasure to say that, but
well, As we mentioned earlier in the episode, going to South Africa in the mid-'80s was a risky move because it violated a literal international mandate. So now we've reached the find out portion of the episode, in which Paul Simon deals with the fallout of this complex socio-political situation. For all the success and praise that greeted Graceland, some critics felt it amounted to a kind of musical colonialism. White man going to Africa, strip mining raw materials, and bringing it home to the West where it could be refined and sold at a massive profit.
I was proud of that line.
It's good. Yeah.
Nice, yeah.
Especially with having a song with diamonds in it. In your African record. Bold choice, Paul.
Yeah. We're gonna get your family back. Down here it's
big helicopter boom boom. Bazooka? What does he say? Big helicopter.
no, it's down here it's bling bang.
Yeah. Jesus Christ.
When I worked at VH1, I think the last time we did a Blood Diamond bit on this show, I did the same thing. My job there was basically writing a listicle a day, and one of them was Leonardo DiCaprio's most ridiculous accents, and he has quite a few, from The Aviator doing Howard Hughes and J. Edgar Hoover, his Boston accent for The Departed, but of course Blood Diamond was high in that list.
Cultural appropriation, particularly at the time, was something of not only an unknown concept, but a gray area. But for many involved in South African politics, it was not. Violating the cultural boycott was pretty absolute and could be interpreted, and often was, as tacit support of the brutal racist regime. James Victor Gabo, the former Ghanaian ambassador to the UN, declared at the time, "When he goes to South Africa, Paul Simon bows to apartheid. He lives in designated hotels for whites. He spends money the way whites have made it possible to spend money there. The money he spends goes to look after white society, not to the townships." Funnily enough, or not funnily enough, I don't know why I went with that segue, Linda Ronstadt's appearance, friend of the pod, Linda Ronstadt. That's the first time we've used that in this episode. Can't believe we've been going for 3 hours and haven't done a friend of the pod. Friend of the pod, Linda Ronstadt's appearance on the album also sparked a major controversy. Not phrases you usually see attached to one another, Linda Ronstadt and controversy.
I love her so much.
We all do, Jordan. Okay?
I know. We do.
Find me someone who hates Linda Ronstadt, and I find you a cold, dead, not beating heart.
Yeah.
She duetted with Paul on the song Under African Skies, which had a bit of lyrical input from her as well. She grew up in the American Southwest and drew parallels between that and the African sunsets. As she said in the classic albums documentary for Graceland, Paul called me up one day and said, "I'm having a hard time writing. Give me some images from your childhood." I said, "Okay."
I took all my words back from Phil, and I still... I need something else.
I need something from you. Come on.
Artie won't return my calls.
All the Africans are tapped out.
Yeah.
Los Lobos is pissed. I've gone down the oppression list to white woman, and I've landed at you. Give me your childhood, please. It's a shame that one won't make it to air. That's a good bit. She told him, "Okay, I grew up in Tucson near the San Javier Mission. I've loved that place and considered it my spiritual homeland. I told him about the mission, and he included that part in the song." And it's a good conceit. It seems to tie in with this theme of trying to get through lines between music of different cultures. But Linda Ronstadt had performed at the aforementioned South African luxury resort Sun City in May of 1983, the venue was located in a semi-independent and semi-fictitious territory that starts with a B. Though officially integrated, the area was effectively the South African equivalent of a North American Indian reservation where many displaced black individuals had been relocated. And either Ronstadt misunderstood the geopolitical complexities of the region or had fallen victim to a promoter's clever ruse to lure international superstars to their resort. But in any event, she accepted the $500,000 fee.
They paid you well at Sun City.
In 83 money. Which caused a controversy. Linda got defensive at first, saying she was booked as a last-minute replacement act and had only 2 days to decide whether or not to play there. And like Paul Simon, she called her black friends. She called her friends at Motown. Did you make that up?
No.
She called her friends at Motown and said, "Is this okay?" And they said yes. And then she got defensive, also like Paul Simon. She told Rolling Stone, "The last place for a boycott is in the arts. I don't like being told I can't go somewhere." Oh, Linda. Though she repeatedly said that her appearances were not an endorsement of the South African government, Ronstadt received worldwide condemnation for the concerts. As we said earlier, Paul himself had previously turned down offers to perform at Sun City, but his decision to feature Linda prominently on this particular album came with some implications. Nelson George of Billboard likened it to using gasoline to put out birthday candles. That's good. Robert Christgau, predictably, was another cynic. Even if the lyric called for total U.S. divestiture, Linda Ronstadt's presence on Graceland would be a slap in the face to the world anti-apartheid movement. A deliberate, considered, headstrong slap in the face.
So that's not good. Paul tried to do some damage control by citing the invitation from the South African Black Musicians Union and insisting that all the musicians were there on their own free will and paid fairly. They split food, lodging, transport, and songwriting credits. He said, "I wasn't going there to take money out of the country. I wasn't being paid for playing to a white audience. I was recording with black groups and paying them and sharing my royalties with them." And guitarist Ray Peary agreed in the documentary classic albums Graceland. He said, "It was two-way traffic. We used Paul as much as Paul used us. There was no abuse. He came at the right time, and he was what we needed to bring our music into the mainstream market. Over 14 million people in the world now know South African music." And Mkithi Khumalo, who played bass with Paul for decades, I think by this point, has said, "Graceland changed my life. That was my passport to the world." And Joseph Shabalala of Ladysmith Black Mambazo has said that the group gave Paul the Zulu name Vutlandela, meaning the one who opens the way. And Paul also cited the fact that he consulted with Harry Belafonte and Quincy Jones in his defense. Paul also went to speak before a crowd of African-American students at Washington, D.C.'s Howard University in January of 1987, a appearance that rapidly turned into a debate with the crowd, many of whom thought that this rich white guy had made a ton of money singing on top of South African singles, basically. One sophomore music major asked him, "How can you justify taking over this music? For too long, artists have stolen African music. It happened with jazz. You're telling me the Gershwin story of Africa. I'll go there, I'll listen to the stuff, and I'll culturally diffuse it." And in response, Paul said, "I went as a musician and I interacted with other musicians. It's true there is another level to the story, but this is the beginning, a sincere beginning. I tried to introduce this music to people who've never heard it before. Sincerity doesn't seem to be held in high regard. I'm here. I'm listening. I respond the best I can. At least I'm into dialogue. I have always intended that this music be used to serve the African people." What do you think about that?
It's alarmingly close to the apologies people make today when they're forced into some kind of racially tinged corner. You know, I am learning and participating in a dialogue.
I am here. I am listening.
Yeah. I see you and I respect you. Have some more money, please.
Well, the debate heated up when Paul announced a 6-month world tour entitled Graceland, the African Concert. You didn't need the suffix there. Just the Graceland tour would have been fine. Okay. Anyway, it would feature his crew of South African session players and Ladysmith Black Mambazo, as well as South African exiles Hugh Masekela and Miriam Makeba. And as 1987 dawned, Paul found himself on the UN Anti-Apartheid Committee's boycott violators list, putting him in some pretty unsavory company. He wrote an impassioned letter to the UN, and at a press conference the day before the tour was due to start, he proudly announced that the UN committee had removed his name from the boycott list. Controversy over, right? No. There was criticism and even active protests from anti-apartheid groups all over the world. When the tour hit London, there were picketers as well as an open letter from some big-name rock musicians, including Paul Weller and Billy Bragg. They and others were angry that Paul had gone to South Africa in the first place, and were also angry by the lack of overt protest music, which we touched on earlier, which made it seem as though he just took their music but lacked the courage to back their basic cause. As with the Graceland record, Paul thought that the tour was the political statement, especially considering the addition of Hugh Masekela and Miriam Makeba, both of whom have been living in exile, I think, for decades, both of whom aggressively wanted to tour as well. And Miriam Makeba, I don't think she was even allowed back into the country to bury her own daughter. So, these people wanted to be out there. So Paul thought the tour would put a face to the atrocities happening in South Africa by allowing audiences across the globe to hear this beautiful music and seeing it being performed by these brilliant, virtuosic, charismatic people. And Paul staged not one but two massive outdoor concerts in Zimbabwe, which was as close as Paul could get to South Africa. And at one point during each show, the musicians sang the South African national anthem, which was always a very powerful moment. And initially, Paul would step back during this moment because he wanted the musicians to, this was their moment. Again, he didn't want to speak for them. But all the musicians really wanted him to stand with them and sing with them, so they taught him the words, and for the rest of the tour, he would sing the national anthem alongside them, and this was his way of very quite literally standing with them. And the other side of this argument, as expressed by Dali Tambo in the Under African Skies documentary, was that the boycott was designed for South Africans to stand together as a nation, and what was good for a few artists was not good for the benefit of the nation. Paul countered this by saying that he was sick of feeling as though artists work for politicians. To him, it was a slippery slope from asking permission to enter a country to make music to having to get lyrics signed off on and various other forms of censorship. And Paul's quote at the time was, "What gives governments the right to wear the cloak of morality? Their morality comes out of the barrel of a gun." It's a thorny issue, and both Paul and Dali Tambo basically agreed to disagree with utmost respect for one another some 25 years after the fact. There's a very touching moment in the Under African Skies documentary where they embrace, which is very powerful. All this to say, the Graceland tour was tense. Before every concert, they had bomb-sniffing dogs go through each venue, and a few theaters were evacuated and shows postponed because of the bomb threats. And in one city, a hand grenade was thrown into a building that housed some sound equipment for the concerts. Paul was obviously distressed by all this, and he would have been much more distressed to know that at the time, his name was on the top of a hit list. He was saved from this tragic fate by apparently none other than Stevie Van Zandt of the E Street Band. This is according to Stevie Van Zandt of the E Street Band. Stevie had been active in the South African freedom movement for many years, founding the Artists United Against Apartheid organization, and he had written, produced, and performed on the 1985 protest song Sun City, and even asked Paul to sing on it, but Paul had refused. He'd asked to see an early draft of the lyrics, which had called out his friend Linda Ronstadt by name, and he decided, no, maybe not, maybe I won't do this. And things between Paul and Stevie got pretty cold for a while. Stevie, who it should be said likes to talk, likes to tell stories, claimed that Paul started questioning his pro-Nelson Mandela stance around this time, going so far as asking Stevie, "What are you doing defending this communist?"
Yeah.
I don't know if it's just what Stevie says. So Stevie's anti-apartheid activism led him to the South African township of Soweto to meet with a group of militant black radicals known as the Azanian People's Organization, or AZAPO. And these people were so hardcore that they had a lengthy discussion with Stevie about whether or not to kill him on the spot simply for showing up. Again, this is according to Stevie. That's how serious they were about violating the boycott, Stevie later said. "I eventually talked them out of killing me." Yeah, sometimes I really wonder how full of crap he is, but I read his memoir.
Medium to very.
Yeah. But Stevie eventually gained their trust and was supposedly shown their hit list with Paul Simon at the top of it. Stevie later claimed, "In spite of my feelings about Paul Simon, I said to them, listen, I understand your feelings about this. I might even share them, but this is not going to help anybody if you knock off Paul Simon. Trust me on this, all right? Let's put that aside for a moment. Give me a year or so to try to do this a different way. I'm trying to actually unify the music community around this, which may or may not include Paul Simon, but I don't want it to be a distraction. I just don't need that distraction right now. I got to keep my eye on the ball." And they took him off the assassinations list. I'm just picturing, what's his name from The Sopranos?
Yeah, he's in the Silvio Dante. Is it funnier if he's as Silvio Dante, or if it's funnier if he's in the like gypsy do-rag and like pirate blouse?
Your mileage may vary.
Yeah.
So yeah, he is a great storyteller. I wouldn't put him past him to make up all this stuff just to make Paul feel kind of bad for being a little
Weasley,
a little stinker to him.
just a little that is the perfect Paul Simon. Just a little stinker.
Paul was being mean to me, and you know what? I got his name off the. That'd be the funniest way for the story, is if Stevie made up this whole story, getting Paul's name taken off a hit list in South Africa. That's the perfect kicker to this, is that Stevie made it up to make Paul Simon feel guilty.
But it had a happy ending, except for the part where Paul Simon almost got killed again, despite the best efforts of presumably E Street Band bassist Gary Talent. Or who's the John Mellencamp? What other Heartland rocker might have helped? The political instruments of apartheid had started to fall apart by the end of the 1980s, and by 1990, Nelson Mandela was a free man. This victory jump-started the fight for majority rule in South Africa, and in 1991, the cultural boycott was lifted. At the invitation of Mandela, and with the full support of the African National Congress, Paul Simon and his band were welcomed back to the country for a series of 5 shows in early 1992, making him the first major international artist to perform in a free South Africa. The visit started off well with a formal reception from Mandela, and quite literally Paul Simon's photo op and shot at redemption. But then later that night, someone threw 3 hand grenades into the office of the promoter who had booked him, destroying it completely. No one was hurt, but Paul was understandably shaken. A sect of the militant Azapo organization, the one that supposedly had him on their hit list, claimed responsibility. And while Stevie Van Zandt had supposedly been successful in persuading them not to kill Paul, they still did not want the concerts to occur. Paul paced his bedroom for hours, debating whether or not to cancel the shows, but local security forces insisted that this militant organization consisted of, quote, 3 guys and a fax machine. Simon had a clandestine meeting with representatives of the organization in an effort to negotiate a truce, with Paul offering them a portion of the tour's proceeds, but they refused to compromise. Later, they appeared at a press conference to deliver a pretty unambiguous threat. We have always pointed out that should his show go on, there is the potential for violence. Nearly 100 demonstrators congregated outside the venue before the show on January 11th, 1992, many brandishing placards that promised blood on the soles of Simon's shoes. But was that a poetic license or an actual verbatim signage?
I think it was actual verbatim signage, I believe.
Hell yeah, that rules. But ultimately, they were dispersed by 800 policemen, and Paul Simon was finally able to perform for the people who had inspired his music.
Well, I think we've just about reached the end of our discussion of Graceland. And given the complexities around this piece of art, I feel wary of tying up this episode in a neat little bow. Something about having a Hollywood happy ending feels inappropriate given the content, but Nelson Mandela was freed, apartheid was dismantled, and these songs continue to touch people's hearts and serve as an access point for an untold number of people to discover the sounds of not only South Africa, but many different cultures. And, you know, that sounds like a happy ending to me. Paul Simon later said of Graceland, it made a very powerful point gently. It wasn't an album that said, there's terrible evil here in South Africa. It said, there's incredible beauty here. And that's a very powerful point.
Yes, I agree. No, I would just say that for anyone who is interested in this stuff, the Indestructible Beat of Soweto compilation is a really good place to start. There's also a bunch of compilations called Rough Guides that do a different sort of stylistic breakdown of these different things. There's a record label called Sahel Sounds that does a lot of good stuff from sub-Saharan Africa. And there is a website called Africa as a Country that writes about a lot of this cultural stuff that I can recommend. But, you know, it's always good to be curious about all this kind of stuff. And again, that's a net positive. That's how I think about it. So if it gets more people listening to that and learning about it, and more music fans and more musicians is not
and learning about people who aren't like yourself,
those are not bad things. Folks, thank you for listening. This has been Too Much Information. I'm Alex Heigl.
And I'm Jordan Runtagh. We'll catch you next time. Too Much Information was a production of iHeart Radio.
The show's executive producers are Noel Brown and Jordan Runtagh.
The show's supervising producer is Michael Alder June.
The show was researched, written, and hosted by Jordan Runtagh and Alex Heigl.
With original music by Seth Applebaum and the Ghost Funk Orchestra. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. For more podcasts on iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.